There is a moment that tends to arrive quietly for a lot of women in midlife. It doesn't announce itself with a dramatic health crisis or a single bad lab result. It shows up as a gradual shift in how it responds to things that used to work. You notice that your energy doesn't rebound the way that it used to. Motivation feels harder to access, even when you care deeply. Weight becomes more stubborn, not because you're doing less, but because effort is no longer producing the same return. And if you've spent your life being capable, disciplined, and responsible with your health, that shift can feel unsettling. Not because you suddenly stopped trying, but because the rules that you've relied on no longer seem reliable. If you're feeling this conversation is for you. What often happens next is subtle self-blame. You might not say it out loud, but the thought creeps in that maybe you're getting lazy or undisciplined, or that this is just what aging looks like and you should lower your expectations. A lot of women assume that they're doing something wrong because the cultural message around energy and metabolism is rooted in effort. Try harder, push through, eat less, move more, be more consistent. And when these strategies stop working, it's easy to assume that failure is personal. That assumption is not only inaccurate, it's unnecessary. Because what's changing here isn't your character or your commitment. What's changing is the system underneath those behaviors. This is where we need to slow down the conversation and reframe it properly. Energy is not a personality trait. Metabolism is not a moral scorecard. And motivation is not something that you either have or don't have. All three are outputs. They are the visible expression of what's happening at a much deeper level in the body. When those outputs start to falter, it's not a signal to apply more pressure. It's a signal to look upstream. And for women after 50, one of the most important upstream conversations that we can have is about what's happening inside the cell. Most women are never taught to think this way. Health advice is usually delivered from an outside-in perspective. What to eat, how to exercise, how to schedule your day, how to stay consistent. Those things matter, but they're not where the energy originates. Energy is not created by discipline. It's generated biologically. And when that biological process becomes less efficient, no amount of willpower can override it for very long. You can push for a while, but eventually the body is going to push back. Fatigue deepens, recovery slows, inflammation lingers, and the gap between effort and outcome gets wider. What's important to understand is that this shift is not random and it's not a sudden breakdown. It's the result of years of cumulative stress, under recovery, under fueling, hormonal transitions, and metabolic signaling changes that finally reach a point where the body asks for a different kind of support. If you view it through that lens, a lot of confusion starts to dissolve. You're no longer trying to fix yourself. You're learning how to support a system that's been quietly adapting for decades. Now let's talk about this core mechanism, what mitochondria actually do. This is why the conversation matters, because once you understand that energy and metabolism are a cellular process, not the motivational ones, the entire tone of your health journey can change. You can stop fighting your body and start listening to it. You stop interpreting resistance as failure and start seeing it as information. And instead of asking, what's wrong with me? The question becomes, what does my system need now? That question opens the door to clarity, authority, and a much more sustainable way forward. To understand why energy changes after 50, we have to get very clear about where energy actually comes from. Not in a motivational sense and not in a dietary slogan kind of way, but biologically. Every movement that you make, every thought you form, every heartbeat, every act of repair and recovery in your body depends on energy at the cellular level. That energy is not abstract. It's produced inside your cells by structures called mitochondria. You've probably heard of them described as powerhouses of the cell, but that phrase, while catchy, doesn't go nearly far enough. Mitochondria aren't just generators, they are regulators. They decide how much energy gets made and when it gets made, and where it gets prioritized. Think of mitochondria less like a battery and more like a control center. They constantly assess the environment inside and around the cell. They respond to signals about fuel availability, stress, inflammation, hormones, and demand. On those signals, they adjust energy production up or down. When conditions are supportive, mitochondria are flexible and responsive. They generate energy efficiently, they support recovery, and they allow the body to adapt to challenges. When conditions are stressful or inconsistent, mitochondria shifts into a protective mode. Energy production becomes more conservative. Non-essential processes are scaled back. The body prioritizes survival over performance, even if that survival response feels frustrating in a day-to-day life. This is where a lot of confusion comes in. Most people assume that if they're eating food and moving their body, energy should simply show up. But mitochondria don't respond to calories alone. They respond to context. They care about whether fuel is coming in consistently or sporadically. They care about whether stress signals are high or low. They care about whether the body feels safe enough to invest energy in things like muscle repair, metabolic flexibility, and stable mood. When that context becomes chronically demanding, mitochondria adapt by becoming less generous with energy, not to push you, but to protect you. Over time, this adaptive response can start to feel like something's wrong. You might notice that workouts feel harder to recover from, that mental clarity comes and goes. That same amount of effort produces more fatigue and less payoff. But what's actually happening is not a failure of effort. It's a recalibration at the cellular level. Mitochondria are responding to years of signals that told them energy needs to be conserved. And once that pattern's established, simply demanding more output doesn't reverse it. In fact, it often reinforces it. What makes this especially important after 50 is that mitochondria are deeply sensitive to cumulative load. They are influenced by decades of stress exposure, nutritional patterns, sleep quality, inflammation, and hormonal transitions. This doesn't mean damage in a dramatic sense. It means adaptation. Mitochondria are incredibly resilient, but they're also honest. They reflect the environment that they've been operating in. When that environment has been demanding for a long time, they don't instantly switch gears just because you decide that you want more energy. They need a reason to trust that conditions have changed. This is why energy, metabolism, and recovery are so tightly linked. Metabolism isn't just about burning fuel. It's about how efficiently your cells can convert fuel into usable energy without excessive stress. When mitochondrial function is supported, metabolism feels responsive. When it's strained, metabolism feels stubborn. Understand chasing energy through surface level tactics and start recognizing that energy is an outcome of a cellular cooperation. When mitochondria feel supported, when it follows. When they don't, the body holds back, no matter how strong your intentions are. We'll talk about why old strategies stop working. Once you understand that energy is regulated at the cellular level, a lot of frustrating patterns suddenly make sense, especially the moment when strategies that worked for decades stopped producing results. Most women don't change their approach because something feels wrong. They change it because something stops responding. The workouts that once felt energizing now feel depleting. Eating less no longer leads to steady fat loss, but stalled weight and lingering fatigue. Pushing harder doesn't create momentum, it creates burnout. And because effort has always been rewarded in the past, the instinct is to double down. Discipline, more restriction, more control. That instinct is understandable, but at this stage of our lives, this often is the very thing that deepens the problem. Cellular perspective, these old strategies send a very specific message. When fuel is reduced, stress is elevated, and recovery is limited. Mitochondria don't interpret that as a call to perform better. They interpret it as a signal to conserve. Energy production becomes more guarded. The body prioritizes basic survival functions and downshifts everything else. That's why so many women describe feeling like they're doing all the right things and getting less energy, not more. This system is responding exactly as designed, just not in the way that we were taught to expect it. This is where the disconnect between intention and outcome becomes emotionally charged. You're not ignoring your health, you're not disengaged, you're trying to take care of yourself using tools that once worked reliably. But the body you're working with is now operating under a different set of conditions. Years of cumulative stress, metabolic strain, hormonal shifts, and under recovery have changed how those tools land. What used to feel like empowerment now feels like pressure. And pressure is not a neutral input for a nervous system or a cellular environment that's already asking for stability. Most misleading beliefs women carry into midlife is that effort is always benign, that trying harder can't possibly make things worse. But when mitochondria are already operating in protective mode, more intensity often reinforces the signal that conditions are unsafe. More workouts without recovery look like threat, not resilience. More restriction looks like scarcity, not discipline. Even healthy routines can become stressors when they're layered on top of an already taxed system. The body doesn't respond to the label that we give a behavior. It responds to the cumulative load. This is why so many women experience a narrowing of tolerance. Food that were once neutral now feel inflammatory. Workouts that once built strength now leave lingering soreness. Sleep becomes lighter. Energy becomes unpredictable. None of this means that your body is failing. It means it's communicating. Mitochondria don't rebel, they adapt. And adaptation, when misunderstood, often gets mistaken for resistance or stubbornness. In reality, it's a form of self-preservation. The turning point comes when you stop interpreting these signals as obstacles and start seeing them as information. Old strategies stop working not because you've lost your edge, but because the context has changed. The body's no longer willing to trade long-term stability for short-term output. And once you see that clarity, the urge to push through begins to soften. You realize that the path forward isn't about forcing energy back into existence. It's about removing the conditions that taught the body how to hold it back in the first place. This is why it shows up after 50. One of the most important questions women ask at this stage is why it seems to show up now. Why the body tolerated years of pushing, skipping meals, sleeping less, and juggling everything, and then suddenly stopped cooperating. It can feel abrupt, but what's actually happening is gradual. The body doesn't forget stress. It keeps a record. Every season of under recovery, under period of chronic pressure, every time nourishment or rest was delayed in favor of responsibility, gets logged in the system. For a long time, the body compensates, it adapts, it borrows from reserves, and because those compensations work, it's easy to assume the system is limitless. It isn't. Midlife is often when the cost of those adaptations become visible. Not because something's broken overnight, but because of the margin for error narrowing. Hormonal transitions play a role here, not as a flaw, but as a change in signaling. Estrogen, for example, has protective efforts on mitochondrial efficiency, inflammation, and recovery. As those signals shift, the buffering capacity that they once provided decreases. These same outputs now land differently. Stress feels louder. Recovery takes longer. The body becomes more discerning about what's willing to tolerate. This isn't decline, it's just recalibration. What makes this moment emotionally complicated is that it collides with identity. Most women build their sense of capability on being able to handle a lot, to push through fatigue, to put themselves last and still show up. When the body begins asking for different rhythm, it can feel like a loss of competence rather than a request for support. The truth is, the body isn't asking you to do less because you're weaker. It's asking you to do things differently because the environment has changed. Cellular systems that once ran quietly in the background are now asking for conscious care. Another reason this shows up after 50 is cumulative metabolic signaling. Years of dieting, inconsistent fueling, blood sugar swings, inflammation, and sleep disruptions all shape how mitochondria behave. Early on, the system absorbs those hits. Later, it becomes less willing to. The body starts prioritizing predictability over performance. That's why so many women feel like their metabolism has become cautious. It has, not out of spite, but out of intelligence. Mitochondria learns from patterns, and by midlife, they've learned a lot. Now, what's critical to understand is that none of this means that you've missed your window. There is a dangerous narrative that suggests midlife is the point of no return, and that energy loss is inevitable and metabolic decline is permanent. That narrative creates fear and urgency, which only adds to more stress that a system that's already sensitive to it. In reality, this phase is an invitation to work with the body instead of overriding it. When the environment becomes more supportive, mitochondria will respond. They are adaptive by nature. They don't shut down, they wait for safety. Seeing this timing clearly removes a huge amount of self-blame. You stop asking why you can't do what you used to do, and you start asking what your body is asking for now. This shift alone changes how the nervous system responds. It lowers internal pressure. It creates space for restoration instead of resistance. And it sets the stage for a forward path that's based on cooperation rather than control. At this point in the conversation, it's important to slow everything down rather than speed it up. When women finally understand that energy and metabolism are a cellular process, there's often an impulse to immediately fix them, to optimize, to intervene, to do something decisive so that the body will respond again. That impulse, while it makes sense, especially if you're someone who's always been proactive with your health, but the most important thing to integrate here is that energy doesn't return through urgency. It returns through safety, through consistency, through signals that tell the body it no longer needs to brace itself. What restores mitochondria function isn't force, it's trust. Mitochondria are highly responsive to environment, but that responsiveness works both ways. When the body feels rushed, pressured, or threatened by consistent change, energy production stays guarded. When the environment becomes predictable and supportive, energy gradually becomes more available. This is why extreme swings rarely work long-term. Big changes may produce short-term results, but they often reinforce instability at the cellular level. Mitochondria respond to best is reliability, regular nourishment, reasonable demand, adequate recovery, signals that the body doesn't have to earn rest or justify fuel. This is where a lot of women need reassurance. Supporting your cellular health is not about doing less because you've given up. It's about doing things in a way that the body can actually receive. There's nothing passive about restoration. It requires attention, patience, and a willingness to stop interpreting every slowdown as a problem. When energy dips, it's not always a call to push. Often, it's a call to adjust the environment so the system can recalibrate. That recalibration doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen when the signals are consistent. Powerful shifts that you can make is moving from outcome-based pressure to system-based support. Instead of asking your body to perform, you create the conditions that allow performance to emerge naturally. That shift changes the emotional tone of your health journey. It removes the constant self-monitoring and replaces it with curiosity. It turns fatigue into information instead of evidence. It shows you to build trust with a body that's been adapting on your behalf for decades. The real magic of mitochondria isn't that they become optimized or hacked. It's that they respond when the body feels supported. Turns not because you demand it, but because the system no longer needs to withhold it. When you understand that, the path forward becomes calmer and more sustainable. You stop chasing energy and start cultivating it. And that's where true metabolic authority begins. Now, if this connected with you in any way, I would love for you to drop a quick comment and let me know, and this information with another woman that might need it as well. And as always, be good to yourself, be good to others, and keep loving life over 50.